This morning, we are joined by Garrett McQueen, who will be hosting this morning's LAMFcast session. He is the guest curator for next weekend's performance, Seasons of Change, which features seasonal woodwind quintets by men of the past and women of today, performed by ensembles from the Milwaukee and Atlanta Symphony Orchestras. A native of Memphis, Garrett's background is as a bassoon player. He now performs on the airwaves and on the digital stage. Living in Minneapolis, he is the executive producer and co-host of the popular podcast Triloquy. Giving voice and offering space to music by Black and contemporary composers drives his passion for the art form and continues to be his primary interest when it comes to playing the bassoon and advocating for classical music. It is for this reason, and for his extensive knowledge of woodwind repertoire amidst primarily string and vocal winter series, that I've asked Garrett to be the curator on our winter series, bringing it to a close. So welcome, Garrett, and enjoy all of you tuning in this morning to learn.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that incredible introduction. It's my honor and my pleasure to be here. I'm going to do a little talking at you today. I'm going to share my screen and have a little bit of a presentation. And then we're also going to do a little listening. We're going to hear short samples of the works that you're going to enjoy on next week's concert. And before I share my screen and jump into the presentation, I was looking where everyone is calling in from this morning. I want to send a special shout out to Taylor calling in from Boone. We're definitely going to visit Appalachia a little bit today, so special shout out to you. I'm going to share my screen here and hide that. All right, so when I was approached about putting together the pieces for this concert, a lot of different things were going around in my head, different ways in which I can showcase my strengths, my interests, mainly in new and in contemporary music. But after a little while, I decided that it would be great to highlight the woodwind quintet, or the wind quintet, as people say these days. We all listen to lots and lots and lots of string quartets and other sorts of other sorts of chamber music, but there's a rich present and a rich history when it comes to the wind quintet. So I'm really excited to share this with you today and next week. When I think about seasons of change, when I thought about the general theme, I'm thinking about where we are right now, winter turning into spring, this sort of in-between time here in Minnesota, at least in between time for me as a non-Minnesota native. I'm also thinking about a post-COVID world as vaccines begin to start to get passed around and administered. What is the next season of our lives, of society? What is that going to look like? And then, of course, after all of the events locally and globally last summer, we're in a social season of change where we're paying more attention to things like race and gender and how that applies to our art form. So there were a lot of things that went into this. So I really, once again, appreciate your taking the time to be a part of this today. Western classical music institutions are changing, and I programmed this concert to reflect some of the changes that I would like to see when we're all back in person. So I wanted to start with a little information about me and some of my background that will offer some context around why this program looks the way it does. So as you heard from Scott, I grew up in Memphis. I earned my bachelor's degree in bassoon from the University of Memphis under Lacolian, Washington. From there, I went on to the University of Southern California, where I studied with Judy Farmer. And it's Judy who inspired me to really pursue a career as a performer. My plan was to return to my hometown to just be a band director, to be a teacher. And while that's very, very important work, my bassoon teacher at USC encouraged me to reach even farther. So after leaving USC, I took an audition to play with the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, a 2-year contract there. I played with lots and lots of other orchestras during that time. And ultimately, I found myself with the Knoxville Symphony Orchestra down in Appalachia, East Tennessee, where I spent 5 seasons playing second bassoon. Now, as much as I really enjoyed the lifestyle of earning a living as a bassoonist, there were certain things I wasn't seeing, certain conversations that weren't being had. I wasn't seeing myself on the stage or in the audience. I was more often than not the only Black person or even the only person of color in an entire concert experience. Beyond that, I wasn't really hearing myself. I know and knew that there were so many pieces of music by Black composers and composers of color, and of course, women composers who we haven't always seen centered on the stage. So I knew I wanted to change that, and I couldn't quite do it from the stage. So that's when I embarked on my own personal season of change. In 2016, I took an opportunity to host classical radio down at WUOT in Knoxville. It was supposed to be a temporary position as they found a so-called real radio host, but my attention to the music that hasn't always been centered really grew the audience, grew a depth of knowledge in the audience, and it was the start of the second part of my career that I couldn't have seen coming otherwise. One of the biggest things that I did and continue to do is challenge the tradition of classical music, and even down to that phrase, classical music. When we say that phrase, we're usually thinking of music born from the aesthetics and traditions of Western Europe and as they apply to the United States. But the truth is every culture and every country has classical music. We can talk about the centuries old classical music codified on the Indian subcontinent in China, East Asia. We can talk about the indigenous people here in what's now called the United States, all the way back to the motherland, talking about an original people and an original music. So I really challenged that phrase, classical music, and what we connected to it. I also really believed in and continue to believe in celebrating composers before they die. Again, one of the things that we often connect to classical music is that the artists behind this music, the composers, are dead, but classical music as we know it is alive and well. And I think it's very, very, very important to highlight living composers and give them their flowers, celebrate them before they die. As we continue to move ahead, as I mentioned earlier, in our social politics, I'm working to shift attention toward Black and POC composers, as well as women composers, because there's so much there that's being overlooked. As I continue to do those things on local radio in Knoxville, I was invited to join the national airwaves, and for the past 7 months, I've been working independently, producing content for broadcasts and digital media. Some of that content includes The Sounds of Kwanzaa, which was syndicated this past December. I currently have a show in national syndication called The Sound of 13, the intersection of classical music and Reconstruction era America. There are many other projects coming down the line, including something called Gateways Radio, and I continue to do lots of digital work in addition to the radio work that I continue to do for the American Composers Forum, the Black Opera Alliance, and many other institutions. One of the questions that I often get when I'm guest curating or when I'm presenting over the airwaves or on digital media is, do I feel pigeonholed? Have I become the guy who can only talk about Black classical music by people of color, by women? And the short answer is no. I feel like it's what I'm supposed to be doing. So I hope today's presentation and next week's concert inspires you to dig into the so-called classical catalog, and to look for something a little different, something that might highlight things that you don't know or didn't always know. So the first composer featured on this program is the one and only Jennifer Higdon. I always try to include Jennifer Higdon's music in my presentations, A, because her music is really phenomenal, but B, there's a East Tennessee, Appalachia sort of connection. Back when I was on the radio at WUOT in Knoxville, we did all sorts of community events. And a question that I got that I'll never forget, it came from some folks who grew up with Ms. Higdon. She was born in New York, spent a lot of time down in Atlanta, but as a young girl, spent her time in a small town outside of Knoxville called Maryville. I don't know if she's from Maryville specifically, but that general area. Anyway, folks from that area asked me the question, does she write classical music? Does Jennifer Higdon write classical music? Of course, folks in her community are going to support what she's doing, so they listen to her music, but it doesn't really line up with their oral definitions of classical music. And I've never forgotten that question, because I think it's a shining example again again, of the seasons of change that we all need to try to see in this art form. Higdon's music is most certainly classical in my opinion, even if much of it doesn't sound what is idiomatic to the genre. And she's been celebrated for the change that she's bringing into the genre. In 2010, she won the Pulitzer Prize for her violin concerto. She's also won a number of Grammys and other awards, and continues to champion not only women composers, but LGBTQ composers in her work, which is something that I think is very, very, very important to really focus in on these days as artists. I brought in a quote from Jennifer Higdon that sort of speaks to the spirit of this composition that's on the program, Autumn Music. She says, autumn comes to us in many guises, incredible explosions of color, air that suddenly snaps with crispness and clarity, a tinge of melancholy on the eve of change in all of our lives. This piece is a musical portrait of the essence and images of autumn. You know, when I think about that quote from Jennifer Higdon, those program notes for autumn music, I think about how it's just so easy to fear or to question what lies ahead. When we go from summer into fall, you know, many of us are thinking about, oh, well, what comes next? What is winter going to look like? We have to savor fall. Even coming from Tennessee, even East Tennessee, where Jennifer Higdon spent many of her lives, autumn is such it's a longer season down south than it is in Minnesota. So again, you know, that the fear and the stress of something being temporary, but taking the time to savor every single moment is crucial. If even the fact that autumn, a true autumn, at least from my perspective here in Minnesota, is only a couple weeks long, it makes the need to really celebrate and savor each of those moments even more crucial. And I think all of that comes through Jennifer Higdon's composition called Autumn Music. So I thought we would listen to a little bit of Autumn Music. I've selected a performance of it for you featuring the Eastman School of Music Chamber Ensemble. We'll listen to about a minute or so of its opening. So as you can hear there, it's a very colorful piece, even from the opening. When I hear those opening trills, I think about a wind blowing through autumn leaves, maybe even blowing a few of them off the tree, you know, just really speaking to that imagery, that beautiful imagery of autumn. So I think you're really going to enjoy hearing that next week. So one of the things I like to show people, as much as I really cherish new music, contemporary music, music by living composers, when it comes specifically to the woodwind quintet, I like to show people the history of it. It's easy to see, again, the string quartet as something that is deeply rooted in the classical tradition, and the woodwind quintet, or the wind quintet rather, as something that's more contemporary. But there is definitely a long and rich history for that sort of music. So the person pictured here in both of these images is the next composer that's going to be featured on the program, a German composer whose name was Franz Danzy. He was a cellist, and he started his career, as a musician around the year of 1778. And just as a quick aside, when I'm programming music for all of my projects, when I hear about composers who lived in the mid to late 18th century, I immediately jump back over to the United States. If you think about what was happening here in the year of 1778. I think it really offers an interesting context for the way we have centered the European canon and what we call classical music. So that just as an aside. But anyway, he started his career as a cellist around the year of 1778 and quickly started to compose. There was another composer on the scene around that time named Anton Reicha. So between Reicha and Franz Danzi, they're often noted as the people who codified what we call the wind quintet, putting a flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon, and horn together intentionally and writing music specifically for that sort of aesthetic and for that sort of ensemble. Franz Danzi, in addition to working as a cellist and helping codify the wind quintet, he rubbed shoulders with many of the greats. Mozart himself loved Danzi, and Danzi loved Mozart, and he really revered him and considered him one of his mentors. Beethoven, whose name we all know, didn't have the exact same, how can I say, spot in Danzi's life. While Danzi did respect Beethoven, he had mixed feelings about him and wasn't sure about the changes that Beethoven was bringing to orchestral music. But of course, as we all know, those changes that Beethoven brought into the orchestra definitely stuck. I also wanted to mention that Franz Danzi was the teacher of a composer named Carl Maria von Weber. I don't know how familiar he is to many of you, but Weber definitely is an integral composer of European music that really centers the sound of woodwind instruments. He wrote 2 really incredible bassoon works, has a number of pieces for solo clarinet and much, much more. So as the wind quintet, as codified by Reicha and Franz Danzi, started to really take hold, what people were noticing is that Danzi was writing for these instruments in an idiomatic way. So when we go earlier in chamber music, if it included a bassoon or a flute, an oboe, maybe even a clarinet and a horn back in those days, it was often for support or to add something to what was already existing. Well, what Danzi did alongside Reicha was really write music that showcased the sound of not only these instruments separately, but the unique sounds that they make together. And as we see, it's a tradition that has definitely stuck over the years. We started with autumn music. So I consider the Danzi that you're going to hear an ode to winter in a way. And I brought in a Maya Angelou quote to help me. She said, "I have heard it said that winter too will pass, that spring is a sign that summer is due at last. See, all we have to do is hang on." I brought the images you see on the screen there. My very first winter here in Minnesota, I had no idea what snow would do to me or to my life or to my car. I saved this image because it's the first image of my car being covered in snow, the first time I had to think about digging my car out. So as you can see, I did have some success. So when I think about the changes that Danzi brought in, when I think about the change that winter brings every year and the change that it inspires in us, all of that wraps up for me in this really beautiful composition. I'd like to share a little bit of this work with you. We're going to listen to a little bit of the slow movement of Danzi's Quintet in G minor. This is his second woodwind quintet. This performance features the Diamant Quintet. when I listen to that excerpt, I think about a day in the winter when you're warm and cozy on the inside, maybe wrapped up with a blanket, having a cup of coffee or a cup of cocoa. I really think that the music of Anton Reicha and Franz Danzi, offers a mental image that I think transcends era and time. That music, written in the late 1700s, early 1800s, in some cases, may seem far away from today's discourse, today's conversations, even today's sensibilities. But I think in that music, you can really hear an example of how the sounds of days, even centuries past, can translate in some way to today. So I really think you're going to enjoy that quintet by the late, great Franz Danzi, his quintet number 2 in G minor, his opus 56, if you're keeping score. So we started with Autumn Music by Jennifer Higdon, moving into something a little wintry by Franz Danzi. And we're moving into spring with music by the one and only Valerie Coleman, a very important living flutist and living composer on the scene these days. Ms. Coleman was born in Louisville, Kentucky, and much of her music really honors her hometown and comes from that Louisville perspective. A piece of hers that I've really grown to love over the years is one called Shotgun Houses. And it talks about how when Muhammad Ali died, another Louisville native, all of the violence stopped for a number of days in honor of community and in honor of Muhammad Ali. So in addition to writing music, she's really intentional about writing music that speaks specifically to her home and to many of today's discourses. Last year, in the year of 2020, Ms. Coleman was named Classical Woman of the Year by the program Performance Today. And then she's a key figure in writing music from the Black perspective and music for Black people. I mentioned earlier a Kwanzaa special, a Kwanzaa feature that I had syndicated over the radio in December. Well, you can't talk about classical music, so-called classical music and Kwanzaa without bringing up a tune called Umoja by Valerie Coleman. Umoja, of course, marks the very first day of Kwanzaa. And as I mentioned, it's not, for Valerie Coleman, it's not just about writing music from her perspective as a woman and as a Black woman, but writing music for Black people to enjoy and for Black people to really speak to. Aside from being a incredible flutist and composer, Valerie Coleman is one of the founding members of Imani Winds, pictured there. And I'll quickly tell the story. When I was a youngster, when I was about 12 years old, and I was handed a bassoon by my band director. I had no idea what it was or what to do with it, but I brought it home and went in front of my computer and typed bassoon. I eventually found myself on MySpace and on the MySpace page of Imani Winds. So Monica Ellis, the bassoonist pictured there alongside the rest of the founding members of Imani Winds, are really foundational to my complete perspective on music and everything that I've done in my career so far. Again, we're talking about seasons of change for this concert. And I think they really ushered in some incredible change when they formed, I think 2.5 decades ago now. And through their work with the help of composer Valerie Coleman, they're continuing to usher in lots and lots and lots of change. The piece of music by Valerie Coleman that you're going to hear next week is themed around the woman pictured here, the late, great Josephine Baker. So Josephine Baker was born in St. Louis way back in 1906. She was born to a very, very, very poor family. And again, considering race relations and social politics in those days, it was really hard to find that upward mobility. As a poor young girl, she joined the full-time workforce when she was about 12 years old. She stopped going to school when she was 12 so that she could support herself. It was a very, very dire situation that she was in. As she continued to work, she knew she wanted more, and then she knew that she could be more. So as a sort of side hustle that became a main hustle, she would do singing and dancing on the corners and on the streets just to get people's attention and to get the pennies and nickels that she could. Well, she stuck to it, and at age 15, she joined a traveling vaudeville show, and that's how she made it to New York. Now, of course, it's important to note that those vaudeville shows often involved blackface and other really violent forms of song and theater that subjugated Black people. But that was really her only choice if she didn't want to spend the rest of her life as a maid and as a servant. Her work definitely alienated her from her family and much of many of the Black communities, but it's what she had, and that's how she made it out of St. Louis and into a bigger and brighter life. That vaudeville show eventually made its way to New York, and Josephine Baker stayed in New York for a little while as a part of what was then called the New Negro Movement. It's often referred to these days as the Harlem Renaissance, this time in American history where Black folks were traveling to New York to really discover what it meant to be a Black artist and to produce art from the Black perspective. Of course, the famous story is that when she was in New York, she got an opportunity to join a show that traveled over to Paris. So she went to Paris and found lots of fame, to say the very least. She was received in Paris and across France much more openly than she was in the United States. Over the course of her career in France, she would even return to the United States for tours, and decade after decade, she would come back for a couple of days and find that racism hadn't gone away. There's a famous story that of hers. She's headlining at one of the biggest theaters in New York City and could not get a hotel room in New York City because hotel managers were worried about upsetting their white patrons to see her being treated as the rest of them. So her struggles certainly never went away. But she did find a better life for herself over in France. What's probably the most infamous image of the late Josephine Baker is the one that's to the far right of my screen. The banana skirt image is still iconic, and it represents a symbol of the American jazz age. It represents the spirit of the United States in France. It represents freedom, but it also represents, again, the very dire situation that she was in, being depicted as a jungle woman, a wild woman, a woman that would make a skirt out of bananas was the energy behind the performance, but she still made it her own and managed to make history. That costume, by the way, was a part of a presentation, a piece, a dance. I'm struggling to figure out what to call it, but a performance called Un Vent de Folie, or Wind of Madness. And that word madness is often how Josephine Baker was described in her performance, just getting on stage doing wild motions that brought audiences to their feet and still have people talking. It's important to note that Josephine Baker was much more than just an entertainer, despite the fact that it was very, very, very revolutionary what she was doing as an entertainer. She was more than that. Josephine Baker was a part of the French resistance in France. She was a World War II spy for France, and she even was a part of the American civil rights movement because of her work as a spy and because of her very outspokenness when it came to social change and social justice. She was actually banned from returning to the United States, but the one and only Martin Luther King Jr. Made it possible for her to return so that she could speak on the famous March on Washington that gave us the I Have a Dream speech. Josephine Baker was actually the only woman to speak at that event, and it's a fact that is still little known. I pulled a quote from her speech on that March on Washington. It says, I have always taken the rocky path. I never took the easy one, but as I get older and as I knew I had the power and the strength, I took that rocky path and I tried to smooth it out a little. I wanted to make it easier for you. I wanted you to have a chance at what I had, but I did not want you to have to run away to get it. I'm really moved by that quote and moved by that bit of history because I think about the path for musicians like Valerie Coleman, musicians like myself, artists like Josephine Baker, and that rocky path. So many of us had to run away from our home or from our first love to really make change. For Josephine Baker, it was the United States. For me, it was the world of orchestral performance. Everyone has their story, but as she noted here, that work is so that the next generation does not have to. So I really encourage everyone, aside from this presentation, to really take some time to learn something about Josephine Baker that you may not have known, because I think her story is one that hasn't always been highlighted, but thanks to Valerie Coleman, one that more and more of us know, even translated into music. So I thought we would take a moment to actually listen to an excerpt, a little bit of the opening of Valerie Coleman's Portraits of Josephine. This performance of it actually features the founding members of Imani Winds. As you listen to this, I want you to think back to the sounds codified by Rika and Donzi and see how much the sound of the wind quintet has changed, how Valerie Coleman incorporated jazz and blues and other Black aesthetics into this composition, Portraits of Josephine Baker. So once again, a completely different sound, a completely different aesthetic, but one that tells a story that hasn't always been told. I also think it's really charming to note that Valerie Coleman herself didn't include the flute in that opening. And I think that really speaks to what Valerie Coleman is trying to do in the arts, stepping out of the way and giving other folks a chance to hear stories and perspectives from other people. Just a small example there of the incredible work that Valerie Coleman is doing. So yeah, alongside learning more about Josephine Baker, also check into what Imani Winds is doing. They've been here for so long and have inspired and been foundational to the careers of countless Black musicians and music advocates, myself included. So we've looped all the way around, starting with Jennifer Higdon's Autumn Music, the aesthetically wintry work of Franz Donzi, and Portraits of Josephine that brings in that spirit of spring and something new. Well, we're looping all the way back around to summer with music by Samuel Barber. Samuel Barber was born in 1910 in the town of Westchester, Pennsylvania, and he loved music from a really, really, really early age. I actually learned this only recently. I'm reading here from the Wikipedia of Samuel Barber. He was, when he was about 9, he wrote to his mother, "I've written this to tell you my worrying secret. Now don't cry when I read it, because it is neither yours nor my fault. I suppose I will have to tell it now without any nonsense. To begin with, I was not meant to be an athlete. I was meant to be a composer and will be, I'm sure. I'll ask you one more thing. Don't ask me to forget this unpleasant thing and go play football. Please, sometimes I've been worrying about this so much that it makes me mad, but not very." I think that's very important to note about Samuel Barber, because today, even for me, I had parents. My mother wasn't sure about a career in music. I know that there are many, many other folks, especially people from marginalized communities, who aren't sure if a career in music is actually something that it is appropriate to focus in on. We can see that that sentiment existed over 100 years ago, but Samuel Barber pushed through and created some really, really, really incredible music along the way. In addition to celebrating, that part of Barber's legacy, sometimes I feel like he's a composer who's overlooked. Everyone knows, at least by ear to some extent, Barber's famous Adagio for strings. My introduction to Samuel Barber was through a work for orchestra and choir. Actually, the first orchestra concert I played in my entire life when I was a teenager featured a work of his called Prayers of Kierkegaard, inspired by the words of philosopher for Soren Kierkegaard. Barber also has an incredible violin concerto that people actually gave him a hard time about as he was writing it. There were a lot of complications surrounding that work, but it's most certainly one of the most fiery violin compositions in the entire repertoire, certainly when it comes to American classical music. I also like to include Barber when it comes to representing change, because he did that on a social level. Barber was one of the many composers of decades past who was a member of the LGBT community and didn't hide that. He was outspoken and found friendships with other LGBT composers along the way that opened up to some really incredible collaborations. In the center photo on your screen there, you see Barber in the center alongside composers Aaron Copland and Giancarlo Menotti, two other members of the LGBT community with whom he collaborated and celebrated over the years. So the piece of music by Barber that's on this program is called Summer Music. It's interesting that he chose this title because when it premiered and the time of year that it premiered in Detroit is not summery at all. It premiered in, I believe, 1956 in the city of Detroit at the Detroit Institute of Art. That's pictured there. I tried to find a photo that sort of matched my memories of Detroit in March. And I think that is the most accurate. When I think about March in Detroit, I think of cloudy skies, still plenty of snow on the ground. And yet he chose to title this thing Summer Music, which has always been really interesting to me. You can see a quote there on your screen from Samuel Barber. He says, "I think what's been holding composers back a great deal is that they feel they must have a new style every year. This, in my case, would be hopeless. In fact, it is said that I have no style at all, but that doesn't matter. I just go on doing, as they say, my thing." Excuse me. I believe this takes a certain courage. So when I think about that quote, when I think about his composition, Summer Music, and when it was commissioned and when it premiered, I think about Samuel Barber as this person that's ushering in his own sort of change, not going for a specific style or a specific sound, but really staying true to him. I think you see that over all of his life when it comes to his personal life, his professional life, and even in his musical compositions. I also love this piece, Summer Music, because I consider it very forward looking. Again, we have that word style. This piece of music is very different than Higdon's woodwind quintet music, very different, of course, from that of Donzi, and even a bit different from Portraits of Josephine by Valerie Coleman. It's in one movement and has this humid feel to it that is obviously taking place in the midst of gray skies, at least to my ear, but offers hope for the future as you get deeper on into the piece. It was originally meant to be a work for 7 musicians, a mix of strings and winds. But when it premiered at the Detroit Institute of Art for the Chamber Music Society of Detroit in 1956, it was unveiled as a work for 5 winds, for wind quintet. It's quickly become a staple in the repertoire. There aren't many woodwind players who don't know this piece or have not at least performed this piece. I've personally performed this piece many, many times. So as we celebrate the wind quintet as a subgenre of classical music, in my opinion, you can't talk about woodwind quintet music without talking about Summer Music by Samuel Barber. We're going to listen to a little bit of the opening here as presented by musicians not far from where the piece was originally premiered in Detroit. This performance of the opening of Summer Music features the faculty at the University of Michigan in nearby Ann Arbor. I can't help but to smile. As you can hear there, that work, Summer Music by Samuel Barber, is unlike the other works on this program in that it's very free form. There are definitely some warmer aesthetics in the work and music that is more in the box, within the lines, as I like to say, very rhythmic and very together. But a large portion of that piece really requires musicians of a quintet to communicate with each other right there in the moment. None of it is improvised, but what is written on the page is written in a way to offer each musician their own way of presenting it. It's often been coined as a work that kills wind quintets because of the difficulty of it in that regard. But as I said, it really, really is a staple in the wind quintet repertoire, and I know you're going to enjoy hearing that performed a week from today. It's going to be a very different take on it than what you heard there. Another great thing about Summer Music by Samuel Barber is that every performance is very different because it requires the personality of each of the players. And again, as I mentioned, that opening does sound very gray, very snowy, at least to my ears, but I think it really speaks to looking forward. And as we look forward to what's coming in our real life season of change, as winter begins to turn into spring here into Minnesota, as we think about what's happening in our social politics, a post-COVID world, I think that it's very important to look forward to a brighter future and even name that brighter future, even if the present is a little gray, or in the case of this piece of music, even if the present sounds a little gray. So in wrapping up this portion of the presentation, before I take a look at the chat and open it up for questions and comments, I thought I would bring in a quote by a leader that I really look up to. Her name is Nikki Giovanni. She says here, "Everything will change. The only question is growing up or decaying." We've seen the beginning of the wind quintet, what that sounded like, who codified that. We've seen what it looks like now, the newest of music. I actually believe that Jennifer Higdon is the most contemporary work on this program. And then everything in between, the changes, the seasons that, happened along the way. As we continue to enjoy this thing that we call classical music and celebrate Western instrumental music, it's important to note, I believe, that everything will change. The way this music sounds will change, and we have to be a part of that change so that people in the future can enjoy so much more of our past as it applies to their present and their future. So I really appreciate your listening and allowing me, I'm clicking everything, there we go. I appreciate your listening and allowing me to share my perspective and to share some music with you as it applies to the wind quintet repertoire and chamber music. It's really, really phenomenal. I'm gonna go to the, let's see, I'm gonna go to the chat here. I don't, let me see. So I don't think I see any questions, but does anyone have a question or a comment concerning the program or today's presentation or anything you've heard me say rather? Oh, here we are. All right, so Taylor asks, could you talk a bit about the unique challenges of the wind quintet in terms of joining 5 very different instrumental timbres into a unified sound? That's a really great question. Something that I'm thinking about right now is a quote from Igor Stravinsky. In essence, he said that he loved wind instruments because of their unblending qualities. When we think about string music, we use that word blend a lot. We use that word when it comes to wind music as well, but a flute sounds very different from a bassoon. An oboe is very different in many ways than a horn, a French horn. So I think the difficulty is a part of the novelty and the beauty of the wind quintet. You have all of these different sounds, these a sort of musical bouquet, if you will, a musical salad that really highlights, again, as I said, each of the individual sounds and each of the individual aesthetics, but also what they sound like and what they really what they bring together. It can definitely be difficult personnel wise, because there are many, in my experience, it's much easier to replace a violin in your string quartet as opposed to replacing the oboist or the flute player in your woodwind quintet. There's a certain amount of rapport that's required, a certain amount of communication, all while you're playing your instrument. Unlike stringed instruments, the instrument is in our mouth or involves our mouth. So it's not like we can lip things or say things. We have to really be conscious about how we use our bodies and even how we use our music. When you watch next week's, particularly the performance of Barber's Summer Music, you're going to see a lot of movement. You're going to see a lot of gesturing. You're going to see a lot of conducting because, you know, the music is very different and requires different skills. It's not easy. I would definitely say it's one of the more challenging things that I've done in my life, being in a woodwind quintet, working in a woodwind quintet and performing that music. It's not easy. It's definitely a challenge, but the tradition is there. The history is there. And I see it as a part of my responsibility to highlight it as often as I can, because when instruments are incredible. I'm biased as a bassoonist, but I really love the aesthetic that wind instruments bring. Thank you so much for that question, Taylor. Are there any other